4 June 1942, northeast of Midway, the Pacific horizon, is a hard blue line, and the carriers ride it like moving islands. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's flight decks are clean and orderly crews sure-handed the plan, as simple as a sprung snare hit the atoll, force the Americans to come finish their carriers in the open. Far astern, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher keep their ships masked by distance and cloud. 3 decks, where there should have been 2, because Yorktown has returned from Pearl after a 72-hour. Triage steel still warm from the welders, paint not yet dry on patched plates. Kido Butai expects the rhythm they've drilled 100 times. Scouts report ordnance loads, combat air, patrol cycles, strike goes. They've done this before. They are relaxed. The first specs arrive from an angle that doesn't fit the diagram. SBDs dropping out of a pale ceiling, canopies, open engines, high and even. A sight picture settles. A bomb leaves a hand. Kaga blooms first, a bright white flash that turns yellow and then orange as fuel, and bombs on the hangar deck breathe at once. Soryu lifts as if punched from beneath smoke, threading the wind like a black pennant. On Akagi, one clean hit bites aft of the island and finds everything that matters in a carrier. Gasoline lines, parked aircraft, men running with chocks in their fists. The noise is not one explosion, but a long tearing through air and steel. Then the heat arrives, then the pieces. For a breath, there is no radio call, no elegant order, only men staring at a flight deck that is now a furnace. Far to the east, a patched American deck keeps turning into the wind, ready to launch again. The trap is still set, but the bait has teeth. By the last week of May 1942, the Pacific is a logistics race played out on open water. Isoroku Yamamoto's staff has written a clean problem: seize Midway, force the American carriers to show themselves, cut them down beyond the atoll where there is no land-based cover. He calls it a trap because everything about the geometry favors the side that controls the timing. Scout lines, thrown far ahead, combat air patrol, revolving like a clock over 4 decks, strike groups spotted with ordnance matched to the target. The assumption underneath is simple: the Americans will arrive late, short, or not at all. Yorktown was mauled at Coral Sea. 2 decks should be all they face. That expectation is the calm you feel in the way Japanese deck crews move, measured, crisp, certain that the next motion will be the one they've rehearsed since day one. Across the ocean in Pearl Harbor, Chester Nimitz runs a different kind of math. If Yorktown stays in the yard, the trap closes around 2 thin American flight decks, and the initiative goes with them. If she sails patched and tired, the problem flips. Welders work 3 shifts inside a hull that still smells of burned insulation. Damage control parties practice as if the next hit is already inbound. She leaves with scars still warm enough steam to turn into the wind and recover planes, and that is all that matters. The message to every aviator who will fly off her is blunt: your runway exists because men made it exist in 3 days. Use it. The battlefield itself is austere. Midway is a flat ring of coral and scrub with a runway and radar, nothing to hide behind once you leave the circuit. Out in the blue fleets are lines of steel traveling inside their own weather. Visibility is a weapon, cloud bands haze the low glare of morning. Timing is another. Japanese doctrine expects a certain beat to American operations, a certain delay in finding them, a certain reluctance to commit piecemeal. American codebreakers shave minutes off the search by pointing Spruance and Fletcher to where the trap is supposed to spring. The plan is not to smash into the bait, but to arrive before the jaws close. For Nagumo, the risk is hidden in routine. He must bomb the island to blind its scouts and gun crews. He must keep fighters cycling to guard the decks. He must be ready to rearm for ship killing as soon as carriers are confirmed. Each of those tasks competes for the same square meters of planked wood. When a commander believes he controls the schedule, he accepts the nuisance of switching ordnance on a hot deck and trusts the train of bomb carts, hand signals, and hose lines to keep up. That is what trap means in practice, not an ambush in a narrow pass, but a belief that your own system will always be on time. For Spruance, the risk is different. He cannot outnumber Kido Butai, so he must ruin its timing. He launches early, accepts that his formations will not arrive in one picture-perfect wave, and trusts that scattered pressure will pull fighters down, and open a seam at altitude for dive bombers. He keeps the radios mostly quiet. He keeps the ships masked by weather. He treats each deck cycle like a promise. As long as an American carrier can turn into the wind and catch aircraft back aboard, the fight continues on terms the enemy did not plan. Everything hangs on minutes and on confidence. Japanese air groups are seasoned, but they are finite. Replacing a lost leader is no longer trivial. American crews are a mix, some green, some already tested, backed by a base that can throw men and parts at problems faster than the ocean can strip paint. If the trap works, the United States bleeds for months, while Japan consolidates a shield out toward Hawaii. If the trap fails, Japan loses not only hulls, but the aura that kept enemies cautious. The difference between those futures is the deck at Pearl that would not sleep and the decision by a quiet analytical admiral to send a wounded ship back into blue water. So the stakes are not abstract. If Yorktown does not appear on the horizon, Japanese doctrine stays intact, a tidy sequence of scouts, loads, strikes and recoveries, the metronome of dominance they have lived by since the year began. With Yorktown present, the sequence frays. American search patterns thicken. Torpedo planes that cannot hurt you much by themselves still force your fighters down at the wrong moment. Dive bombers arriving late from high sky need only seconds of steady sight to make a carrier into a torch. And on a flat ocean with nowhere to hide, a single burned deck changes how every other captain thinks about the next hour. That is why this fight matters beyond one morning and a few names on a chart. A trap is a script. Midway asks whose script survives contact with steel heat and hurry. The Japanese bring 4 decks and the comfort of a plan that has worked since December. The Americans bring 3 decks because men welded one of them back to life in roughly 72 hours, and they bring a willingness to break their own neatness, to break the enemy's timing. From that contrast, the rest of the battle will follow. The weapon that makes Japanese carrier aviation feel inevitable is rhythm. Scouts fan out on schedule, fighters orbit on schedule, bomb carts roll on schedule. On a clean deck, timing is protection. Zeros scream down from the cap with fuel enough to linger, climb light, and be back on station before the next group needs cover. Bomb trucks move nose to tail along painted lines. Hose crews top off tanks until the gauge needles align with a chalk mark. In that order, the enemy's presence is just a variable that slots into the day's pattern. Pilots trust the feel of a Zero's stick at the edge of buffet, the way it will hold a high-angle turn long enough to rake a torpedo plane that insists on flying level over whitecaps. On the hangar decks below, aircraft are staged with their tails toward open lifts, propeller arcs aligned so a pull on a sleeve starts 3 engines in a row. When a system like that runs, it makes men sure. It whispers that whatever appears on the horizon will be handled in its turn. The fear on the American side does not begin with the Zero's climb rate or the accuracy of a B-5N torpedo run. It begins with the knowledge that you are fighting a machine made of procedures, and that one lapse in your own sequence means you arrive late and alone. A torpedo bomber's cockpit smells of oil and canvas and a little seawater because the pilot cracked the side window earlier to wipe salt from his glasses. At 100 feet, the wake is a white line, and the altimeter needle trembles with each gust. The canopy frame shudders. The throttle stays wide. The nose won't lift without losing speed. The pilot knows the cap will eat him, but his job is not to survive. His job is to pull fighters down from 12,000 feet, so someone else has clean sky. The deck cycle is a living thing. On the Japanese carriers, the lifts rise with aircraft whose bellies carry land bombs for Midway's runways. Ordnance crews begin the switch when word filters up that enemy carriers may be near. A bomb is unshackled and rolled back. A torpedo is muscled forward on a cradle. Safety pins dangle from a crewman's mouth. The hot deck smells like gasoline and warm paint. This is where rhythm turns to risk the moment when you are half one thing, half another. A single aircraft at the wrong corner, cartwheel on a brake failure, and the line of hose, the neat row of bomb carts, the open boxes of fuses, become fuel for minutes of heat you cannot put out. The dive bomber's advantage is not listed on a placard. It is a sensation the way the perforated brakes bite, and the airframe steadies so the reticle stops walking. The pilot plants his elbows. His world reduces to the carrier's island, the slant of the wake, the rectangular geometry of a deck spotted with aircraft and hoses and men. He has practiced with a destroyer's wake. Today the target is bigger, but the physics are the same. You do not talk in the dive. You do not glance at the clock. You feel the descent rate through the seat, and you ride it until the ship swells to fill the glass. Then a small pressure on the release. The aircraft jumps an inch lighter. You count 1, 2, 3, and pull until blood drags your eyelids down. If you have 10 knots more or less at entry, the picture changes. If the ship under you is rolling, your sight drifts. Today the sea is cooperative, and the sun cuts shadows that define edges. That is enough. Zeros will punish any mistake in that profile, but they cannot be above and below and in front at once. The torpedo planes keep them busy in a vertical stack that never looks clean from the Japanese bridge. A controller calls altitudes, then revises them, then wants a second section to drop lower. Fighters pitch out to chase a dot that refuses to turn away, and while that dot is dying, it is pulling the defensive umbrella down where a different geometry rules. At 15,000 feet, the SBDs come with canopies open an inch for airflow and a fist wrapped tight around the stick. The rear gunners hold their fire until a trace of silver crosses the arc of sky behind. A controlled burst, then nothing because tracers reveal you, and there is no time to admire a hit. On Yorktown, patched plates rumble under boots that have not forgotten the noise of Coral Sea. The catwalks ring when the bow bites spray. That vibration tells the deck crews they have enough wind for the next launch. The arresting wires feel slack on the first recovery pass, then bite, then are checked and set again. In the island, airplot keeps grease pencil lines aligned with a commander's intent that changes every 5 minutes. The ship does not need to be pretty. She needs to keep turning into wind long enough to pump aircraft into the sky at the times the enemy does not expect. Weld seams, new and bright, stink when they warm. Men touch them without thinking, then wipe their palms on their trousers. The ship reminds everyone that it exists by will, not by comfort. For the Japanese, the hangar deck is both strength and trap. The reason their strikes look like a drill film is because the staging space below is generous. You can load undercover and bring whole packets of airplanes up at once, fueled and armed, ready to spot 4 and launch. But a generous space takes whatever you put into it and keeps it. Gasoline vapor hangs in places you cannot see. Bombs that were meant for dirt strips sit near torpedoes meant for hulls, because the decision to switch came between scout reports. A single burning puddle runs along a groove in the planking and finds a seam you did not respect enough. When a bomb from above punches through and stops, where the work is neatest, all that neatness becomes accelerant. American radar and code work are not numbers to quote. They are minutes you do not waste searching the wrong patch of ocean. A controller on Midway uses a soft voice to send fighters where they might matter. The radar set thrums, the scope is a green hush. On the carriers, the choice is less about frequency and more about faith. Launch now, even if your squadrons form up ragged, because a ragged picture in the right place is better than a parade in the wrong one. Pilots fly on headings that feel like guesses until a shadow cuts the sea at an angle that has to be awake. Then training finishes the problem. The dive is a muscle memory. The pullout is pain. The radio call is a single word that means hit or miss and nothing more. The zero remains deadly throughout. It will outclimb an American bomber that hesitates. It will roll with a lightness that makes a rear gunner swear into the slipstream. But the cap's weakness is the same as any finite resource it can be spent. The first hour drains it by inches. Pilots burn fuel faster when they chase low targets. Controllers pull sections down to deal with a nuisance that will not go away. By the time the threat that matters arrives high, fast, precise, the deck crews are in mid-change, the fighters are at the wrong height, and the men whose job is to wave off risk are trapped inside their own tempo. On both sides, the only numbers that matter now are the ones tied to seconds. How long to spot 10 aircraft? How many minutes until a torpedo crew can arm and roll? How many heartbeats between the moment a bomb leaves a hand and the moment a hangar deck, full of fuel, vapor turns white, then yellow, then orange? The difference between systems is not that one is brave and the other is not. It is that one can afford to break its own neatness for an advantage and still fight on the next cycle. The other depends on neatness to survive. When that neatness shatters under heat and steel, experience and courage do not change the physics. A patched American deck that can still turn into the wind is enough to keep the machine fed. A Japanese deck that has become a furnace is a signal that the rhythm has ended. From there, the rest is a sequence of recoveries that never quite happen and fighters that land with empty guns because there is nowhere safe to park them. This is how specifications become survival. The Zero's grace, the B5Ns, steadiness in a torpedo, run the speed of a deck crew with chocks in their fists. Each is lethal when the schedule is yours. The SBD's dive breaks the patience to let a sight picture settle the stubborn return of a wounded ship to the line. Each is decisive when the schedule is contested. At Midway, the fight is not who can fly faster in a brochure. It is who can hold a picture still for 3 seconds while the other man's pattern unravels. Wade McCluskey banks the Enterprise SBD, hard right, and watches a single white line on the water angle away like a stitch. Arashi running to catch up after chasing a submarine. He does not announce a revelation, he just holds the turn and points the whole group down the wake because the geometry says a carrier force is at the end of that line. The air smells of lacquer and hot oil. The wind drums the canopy frame. Behind him the formation drifts wider than he wants, but fuel is thin and time is gone. He squeezes the microphone once. There. Richard Best sits higher in the seat, loosens his shoulders, and checks the dive brakes by feel. The ocean is an enormous flat plate. The carriers pop out of haze as rectangles with delicate strokes of rigging and cranes. Fighters are busy low. The picture above is cleaner than it should be. McCluskey's order is a wire in the ear, take the left-hand ship. Best's wingmen acknowledge with clicks because words waste seconds. The nose drops into the dive, and the cockpit goes quiet, except for the thin, clean whistle of air over perforated metal. Best's elbows lock. The reticle steadies. The carrier swells deck edge island, the slick shine of gasoline on planking. At this angle, even a heartbeat is a measurement. He sees a man wave frantically at a bomb cart. A hose snakes across the deck like a live rope. He lets the picture breathe 1 count longer than practice because the ship is turning into wind and he needs the bomb to meet the deck where the turn will finish. A small pressure, a jolt of lightness. 1, 2, 3, pull. The G-load drags his eyelids down. The horizon snaps through the glass and the sea jumps toward him, then away. In the mirror, the carrier's stern lifts and a white rectangle flashes where the deck was whole a moment ago. The radio coughs with 1 clipped word. He does not look back. He checks the oil temperature needle, clears the engine with a short burst of throttle, and aims for a sky that already has shapes in it, zeros small and quick, late to the angle he chose. On Yorktown, a boatswain's mate stands at the edge of the deck and feels the ship's bow bite into wind. The patched plates thrum under his boots. It is a vibration he learned to trust at Coral Sea. If it's there, the next plane will fly. If it isn't, someone misjudged. The first SBD to land slams the wire and halts in a hiss of rubber and metal. Yellow shirts run. The signal officer looks over his shoulder once at the island, once at the windsock, then cuts his eyes back to the next approach. Nobody mentions Pearl Harbor or the 3 days in the yard. The ship herself says it with every shiver in the steel. The radar shack is dim and smells of dust and warm paint. A controller traces a green smear with a fingertip and calls a vector without raising his voice. Fighters roll from the deck with the lazy, practiced urgency of men who have repeated the same steps in darkness and rain. Yorktown turns a degree more into the wind to give them a better bite. Somewhere aft, a welder's seam opens a little under the stress of the turn, and a petty officer lays a palm on the hot ridge without thinking, then pulls his hand away fast. He grins despite himself. The ship is alive. Hiryu's counterpunch finds them at noon. The first torpedo spread sets white lines across blue water. Yorktown answers with a hard swing that tilts the horizon for a man on a catwalk until he has to brace his knees. A bomb lands close off the bow, the slap of water and pressure punching into his chest. Another comes through and the deck jumps the air, going white with dust and paint flakes. Damage control teams are already moving because on this ship, every hit is assumed. Hoses run out and stiffen with pressure. The voice on the 1MC is steady and short. Hold your stations. On the Japanese flagship, the bridge watches 2 decks burn elsewhere and tries to put order back into a pattern that only works when decisions are early. A fighter director wants altitude. A deck officer wants the forward elevator. The ordnance chief wants time. The captain speaks in sentences that are too neat for the chaos below. On the hangar deck, men are muscles and breath-hauling torpedoes around a tailwheel, rolling a bomb back into a rack, trying not to think about the smell of gasoline growing sharp near the drains. A mechanic reaches to pull a safety pin and feels heat on his cheek from something he cannot see. It should be another drill. It isn't. Best's section levels low over a white wake engines beating even now that the dive is done. A zero cuts across the rear canopy, and the gunner squeezes a short burst that is more warning than kill. The fighter flashes by and is gone because it cannot be everywhere, and because there are other targets that call louder dots, skimming the water with torpedoes slung underbellies, stubborn and doomed and useful. Best glances once at the fuel gauge, and does the math on distance home. It is not generous. He picks a heading and trusts the needle. On Yorktown, a repair party opens a hatch and finds a space half full of smoke and floating scraps of cork insulation. The heat against their faces says there is a fire one bulkhead over. The team leader touches the steel and judges the temperature at the seam, then sends a messenger instead of a shout, because shouting wastes breath. Foam lines snake forward. A sailor drops to one knee and drives the nozzle under a tangle of cable. For a moment, the smoke thins and shows the silhouette of a wrench on the deck. Someone picks it up without breaking stride. Above them, the ship turns again, the deck angle changing underfoot, the message clear, keep up. McCluskey looks back once and sees columns of smoke that do not move like funnel exhaust. He says nothing. The group is strung out now, stragglers at different altitudes, fuel light flashing on some panels. He does not gather them like a parade. He points the leader's nose toward home and lets the men find their way into a loose line, because that is all the ocean and the day will allow. The radio comes alive with a calm voice from a ship that should not have been there, talking men down through haze to a patch of deck that keeps appearing into wind at the right moment. The voice reminds him of a thing he tries not to think about: welders in Pearl counting hours by the color of the sky, making a runway out of heat and will. On the burning Japanese deck, a junior officer raises a handset and lowers it again because there is nobody left at the other end to receive his crisp phrasing. Men move with the awkward grace of people carrying weight they cannot drop. A line of hose kinks around a chock and a sailor takes a step to fix it, and then there is only white, then yellow, then orange, and he is no longer there. The survivors do not speak. They look at the island at the tilt of the mast against sky, and understand in their bodies what their minds are not ready to say out loud: the schedule has ended. Far away, Yorktown's arresting wire takes another load and whips free with a metallic snap that sounds wrong then right as the crew resets it. An SBD rolls to a stop, and the pilot's hands shake on the throttle only after the engine cuts. He smells burned paint and hot rubber and the faint sweetness of coffee from somewhere he cannot see. He climbs down a ladder and touches a weld seam out of habit. It is warm and real under his palm. The deck officer points him by with 2 fingers and no drama. The ship turns into the wind again. The next launch begins. The outcome begins in a basement full of paper. Code breakers in Honolulu shave hours off the search by proving that AF is Midway and by handing a bearing window to the fleet. That is not trivia. It is fuel-saved patrol sectors, narrowed aircraft launched into the right quadrant instead of the empty one. It lets a quiet Admiral set an ambush inside, an ambush put carriers where the enemy expects helpless land-based fighters, and show them a deck cycle instead. Pearl moves like a factory because it is one. Yorktown slides into a dry space that still stinks of coral sea, and 72 hours later she is back in blue water. The work is not cosmetic. Welders close tiers that would open, when the bow bites wind riggers restring, arresting gear that must take shock without parting. Electricians chase grounds so radios don't die when bombs land close. The ship sails with scars that matter less than the 2 facts that decide whether she contributes or becomes a sunk cost. She can turn into the wind. She can recover and relaunch. That is the whole argument made in steel. Decision-making follows the same logic. American commanders do not wait for a picture-perfect strike package. They launch early on intelligence bearings and accept that formations will be ragged. That choice ruins an opponent's rhythm in ways no single squadron could manage. Torpedo planes become tools that spend enemy fuel and attention at low altitude. Dive bombers arrive late and high. Not because someone wrote it that way, but because scattered departures and different climb profiles make them late and high. The plan is willingness to fight in fragments, if fragments arrive on time. Japanese doctrine at sea is elegant and brittle. The carriers are machines built around a perfect cycle. Scouts out first strike off fighters revolving overhead, second strike spotted below. It works when you set the clock. It breaks when you must change the job midstream. The moment a report hints at enemy carriers' hangar crews reconfigure for ship killing, that means live bombs, torpedoes, and gasoline lines in the same spaces, ordnance dollies rolling past, open fuses, hoses snaking between wingtips. The advantage, high sortie density from covered hangars, becomes the weakness the instant heat and shrapnel intrude. On that day, heat and shrapnel do. Firefighting is where philosophies separate. American carriers drill damage control until it is muscle memory. Foam blankets run first. Compartments are shut fast. Gasoline systems can be isolated at valves men can reach in seconds. Hull subdivision and fire mains are designed with the assumption that hits will happen. It is not that the ships are tougher in some abstract way. They are arranged so that crews can buy minutes while the captain keeps the bow into wind. Japanese carriers rely on not being hit and on the efficiency that comes with staging fully armed aircraft in hangars. When a bomb finds that orderliness, there is too much to burn in one glance and too little redundancy to stop it from traveling where it wants to go. Fighter direction exposes another asymmetry. Midway and the American decks work with radar and low-voice controllers who nudge cap to the right altitude and bearing. It is not a magic shield. It is minutes clawed back from uncertainty. Japanese decks work by plot and eyeball, and controller skill honed against fixed expectations. When nuisance raids refuse to vanish, fighters descend into thicker air and burn fuel faster. When the threat that matters falls from high sky, the umbrella is not where it should be. A system designed to pace itself against planned pulses cannot spend perfectly against noise that never stops. Logistics underwrite courage. Japan crosses a long ocean with limited tanker tonnage and an oil supply chain that narrows with every mile. Each pilot lost at sea is months of training. The empire cannot accelerate. Each carrier is not merely steel. It is the only classroom that teaches deck discipline at speed. America fights next door to a machine city. Spare props and engine blocks ride ships that arrive fast. Replacement crews are queued. A damaged hull can be made serviceable in days if the gamble is worth it. That is why a patched carrier is risked even if she is hurt again. The attempt buys timing that industry can exploit and the other side cannot offset. Command temperaments matter because they determine whether a doctrine bends. On one side, a planner expects the enemy to appear when summoned, so he accepts the inefficiency of changing loads and trusts his schedule to recover. On the other, a newcomer to carrier command is willing to launch into uncertainty and let the geometry work because the alternative is to let the enemy finish setting his trap. Neither posture is romantic. Each is a bet on a system. One requires neatness to survive. The other tolerates mess if mess creates a window. The human pipeline is as decisive as the steel one. Japanese carrier air groups at Midway are experienced and lethal, but they are not bottomless. The replacements still in training will not be ready at that standard for many months. American air groups are mixed. Some leaders have learned their trade the hard way over the Coral Sea and the Marshalls, and many wingmen are still green. Their edge is not a mystical fighting quality. It is the knowledge that if they land, someone will refuel them, rearm them, and send them again, and that there are more crews coming behind. That certainty powers decisions that look reckless from far away, and rational from a flight deck that can take another cycle. Intelligence is not a prelude. It is a constant correction. Before the battle decrypts, pick the day and point the compass. During it, every radio silence and every sighting is weighted against a chart already tilted in the right direction. When a destroyer runs at speed toward a spot on the horizon, an aviator reasons that it trails something larger because the code guys said the enemy would be there today. That turns a hunch into a vector, and a vector into bomb racks over a hangar full of fuel vapor. The trap remains real. The sprung jaws still exist. But the side that knows which thicket hides the iron can approach without being bitten. Production closes what doctrine opens. If a carrier deck burns in an American film reel, the answer is not despair. It is a requisition and a schedule. The ship will either be patched or replaced, and the men who flew from her will teach the next wave what not to do. If a Japanese deck burns, the loss is a hole in 3 different fabrics at once: steel-trained aircrew and institutional memory concentrated on a handful of hulls. The difference shows in the hours after the hits. One fleet thinks about the next launch, the other thinks about how to keep the flames from walking into the magazines. Even the way aircraft are parked is policy. Americans spot planes on deck exposed so that hangars stay clearer and fumes and fuse boxes are not concentrated under a wooden roof. Japanese carriers, optimized for compactness and quick massing of strikes, stage much of their preparation below. It makes for beautiful punctuality until the first penetrator arrives, while hoses and carts are out. Safety becomes a number. How many seconds from hit to uncontrolled fire? How many seconds to isolate gasoline lines? How many seconds to flood a compartment? On that day, the numbers favor the side that can slam a valve and keep turning into wind. What looks like luck is often a byproduct of these choices. A destroyer's wake points a dive bomber to the exact square of ocean where the real targets lie. A torpedo squadron that is mostly killed has still done its job because it drags the defenders out of the altitude band that matters. A patched arresting gear catches a landing that would otherwise crush a tailwheel, and that aircraft flies again 2 hours later. None of this is cinematic. All of it is arithmetic. The Japanese plan assumes the Americans will come late and thin. The Americans arrive early enough and thick enough in time, if not in formation, to knock key pins out of a precise machine. The last piece that locks the picture to the title is the repaired deck that should not have been there by any peacetime standard. It launches, recovers, absorbs punishment, and forces the opponent to split attention when attention is the scarcest commodity on a carrier bridge. That presence turns a clever trap into a fair fight, and then into a race. The system with more cycles per day will win. When the smoke lifts, what dies is not bravery and not skill, it is confidence in a script. A navy that had written the timing for 6 months learns that timing can be stolen. A navy that had bled learns that minutes saved by code work and hours stolen by shipfitters can be turned into bombs falling on hangars at the one moment the other side cannot afford a mistake. From there, the rest of the campaign is not preordained, but it is forewarned the side that can repair a carrier in roughly 72 hours and still fight from it is the side that can keep showing up until the other can't. The first minutes after the bombs land are not victory, they are confusion with heat. Then the shape of the day changes. On Japanese bridges, officers speak in the grammar they have used since December, calm, sequential, composed, and the sea refuses to answer in that order. A carrier that could once turn timing into a weapon is now a silhouette inside its own smoke. Fighters orbit at the wrong heights. The next strike that was supposed to rise from a hangar like a joined thought has become scattered objects. A dolly on its side hoses, snaking a bomb cart, stopped where men left it when the deck bucked. It is the first time since the war began that a whole deck crew understands without being told that neatness will not save them. The realization spreads without a word. In a fighter-ready room, a pilot watches the second hand on a bulkhead clock and feels the futility of counting because there is no deck cycle to meet. He weighs his fuel and the distance home and notices that the assumption launch vector kill recover is gone. In a hangar, a petty officer reaches for a valve and finds it stuck at the quarter turn, where a drill always leaves it. Today the drill means nothing, and the extra seconds it takes to force the handle open feel expensive. On the island, a signalman looks down at a space that used to be a runway and sees a furnace that eats commands. Across the horizon, an American deck keeps working because work is the only answer it knows. The patched carrier that should have been in a yard catches another landing, spots another section forward, noses into wind. Nobody on that ship believes they have made a masterpiece. They believe in the next cycle. That is the opposite of myth. It is repetition under strain, a choice to keep doing the dull things, refuel, rearm, recover, while the other side is discovering how much of its perfection depended on one long sequence never breaking. The psychological break is small at first, a seam you could hide with a sleeve. A controller who has always expected to place fighters exactly where they are needed begins to speak in requests instead of assignments. A captain who has always saved the last neat strike for the decisive blow calculates whether the elevator will move in time and realizes the calculation is theatre. The old calm remains in the voice, but the bridge is no longer a conductor's podium. It is a triage station. Men are still brave and quick and professional. They are no longer certain that the machine they serve will make their bravery count. It sharpens with each attempt to reassert rhythm. A section of Zeros claws for altitude to meet a high threat and finds the air above a burning ship full of turbulence and grit that steals speed from wings. The pilot checks his mixture, checks his prop pitch, doubts the airplane for a second, then hates himself for the doubt. Below hose lines go slack where pressure should surge. A chief barks and points, and the stream thickens again, then thins. A bomb down 3 decks ends the argument. The ceiling dips. The air turns yellow. Men stagger because oxygen has dropped. Someone reaches for a telephone that no longer connects to anything. The silence that follows is not awe. It is the loss of a habit. On the American side, there is no triumphal chorus. A dive bomber that just made a clean hit flies level and fragile, and the pilot stares too long at a fuel gauge that is not kind. A torpedo squadron that did not scratch a carrier still counts its dead and knows the math was bad for them, but good for everyone else because the umbrella is down where it can't matter against the next wave. The lesson both sides feel is the same. The day is not going to obey anyone's script, and whoever can keep doing the necessary things without a script will own the hours that remain. What dies is the assumption that one navy dictates tempo by decree. The proof is in behavior. Japanese formations begin to avoid high sky in the minutes after the hits, not because courage has fled, but because courage now fights for survival, protecting lines to the pumps, keeping flames from walking into magazines, finding places to purr. Land aircraft with tanks close to fumes. Patrols curve away from where the enemy might be, because the air over the fleet is no longer safe without certainty that the deck below can receive them. A doctrine built on setting the day's agenda becomes a doctrine of salvage. This is not a cinematic turning of tides. It is a change in how decisions feel in the body. Before a section leader knew that the next launch would cover his landing and the next strike would follow the one he just escorted. Now he banks and chooses a heading with the alien thought that he may not have a runway when he returns. Before a deck officer moved airplanes like pieces in a problem whose solution had been seen 100 times in drill. Now he counts minutes, as oxygen runs low in compartments he cannot reach, and realizes minutes, not doctrine, will decide. The myth was never invincible. It was predictable. Predictable is gone. The last confirmation arrives when a carrier that was meant to finish the day throws its counterstroke, and it fails to change the geometry. The patched American deck survives the reply and keeps turning into wind. The enemy force, built to spring a trap, is now the side making reactive moves. Pilots who once hunted at their leisure are shepherded to altitudes and bearings chosen by fire and smoke. Staff officers who wrote a clean lure and destroy plan find themselves writing damage reports that speak in cautious language about heat fumes and failed fittings. No one says the word collapse. They do not need to. When dusk comes, the sea is the same indifferent blue it was in the morning, but men think differently inside it. On the American decks, crews finish refueling by reflex and check the lashings one more time. On the Japanese decks that still move under their own power, men walk softer because the planking remembers heat. The fear is not of the enemy's weapons alone. It is of their own system's fragility when struck off schedule. That is the end of the myth. Not banners lowered or a declaration, but the quiet shift from hunting to preserving, from springing traps to stepping around embers, from expecting the enemy to arrive on your time to hoping you can buy enough of your own to get through the place. Night. Dawn the next day shows what the smoke hid. 3 Japanese carriers are black shapes on a flat sea. The 4th will not finish the day. The air crews who made the first months of the war look like a drill film are scattered, some gone with their ships, some rescued into units that cannot be rebuilt at the same pace. Reports grow careful. Phrases like hangar fire, loss of elevator, and fuel vapor ignition begin to appear where confidence used to live. The surviving hulls turn for home without the usual arrogance of schedule, and the staff ashore start calculating how to fly trained men to decks that no longer exist. Yorktown does not live to see sunset after the fight. She is held alive by damage control discipline, then torpedoed again days later and lost. Her value is already spent in the hours she bought. The point is not a single ship's survival, but that a patched deck arrived on time and forced the enemy to divide attention. That timing changes behavior. From this week forward, Japanese carrier doctrine moves with more caution, less appetite to stage full armed packets in hangars while scouts are still out. The neat cycle that defined their power now carries the memory of heat. Film from Midway spray at deck edge tracers bent by wind, carriers burning like lanterns in broad daylight, becomes study material for people who care about minutes, where ordnance lay when the hits came. How long it took foam to blanket a fire, what altitude the cap should have held instead of chasing low. Intelligence officers keep the quiet lessons that a clean trap can be stolen by code work, and a commander willing to launch into uncertainty. That a destroyer at flank speed can tell you more truth than a perfect search grid. The legacy is procedural. American carriers lean even harder into damage control, culture, radar direction, and the unromantic willingness to launch imperfectly if it preserves timing. Japanese carriers carry a different inheritance: irreplaceable crews, fewer decks to train on, and the knowledge that their beautiful rhythm can end in a minute they do not control. The imbalance multiplies over months. Where one side can throw steel and people at the next cycle, the other must preserve what remains and choose when not to risk it. The questions that matter sit close to the title. If the patched ship had not sailed inside, roughly 72 hours, do 2 American decks arrive too thin for the geometry to break? If the enemy had kept hangars clear until contact was certain, does the first set of bombs still find fuel and fuses in the same square of air? How much of that morning was luck, and how much was the predictable result of 2 different ways to run a system under pressure? We'll follow that thread. Next, we go down the ladder from ocean to island Guadalcanal, where a rough airstrip and a tired fleet turn timing into a weapon, one sortie at a time, and where the same habits that put a wounded carrier back to sea decide who can keep. Showing up after dark.